This is the Global China Research Colloquium that we hold here at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of the GDP Center. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And one of our largest research groups is called the Global China Initiative. And welcome to our Global China Research Colloquium. Before I introduce our this week's speaker, let me just tell you about a few things that we have coming over the next couple of days and next week. On some levels, this is SADC week here at the GDP Center, the Southern African Development Community, because I'd like to invite you all tomorrow morning, although it's a little early for those of you on the East Coast, and probably off the table for those of you on the West Coast of the United States, but for folks in Asia and especially Africa, we're going to be releasing a big report that we have been doing with partners in SADC countries called Expanding Renewable Energy for Access and Development, the role of development finance institutions or development banks in Southern Africa. If you go to our webpage under events, or maybe that can be dropped in the chat, you can go to a link to access and register for that one. Then next week, also here on Wednesday at the same time as today, we'll have a presentation by Mir Alkan called Global Markets, Domestic Reforms, ? The Political Economy of China's Overseas Energy Investments. Mir is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University and a GCI fellow here at BU, at the Global Development Policy Center. Today's talk is called Sovereign Debt Through the Lens of Asset Management, Implications for SADC Countries. SADC is the Southern African Development Community and consists of a number of countries on the southern cone of Southern Africa. The lead author on this, despite what you see on the screen that I'm starting to put up here, is a new, let me just get this all the way to the fullest, is a new non-resident senior researcher here at the Global Development Policy Center named Yan Wang. Yan Wang was a longtime senior economist at the World Bank, and more recently a senior economist at the Institute for New Structural Economics at Peking University, with Justin Ifu Lin, the former chief economist of the World Bank. Yan Wang's most recent book is called Beyond Aid, China's Global Economic Cooperation, which is really one of the books, Cambridge University Press, on China's overseas development finance. Yan Wang and I wrote this paper, and right at this very moment, she is quote unquote in Southern Africa for a Southern African Development Community conference on debt restructuring and the debt problem that the countries there are facing. She'll hopefully come in the second 2/3 of this, but I'm gonna get us started if that's okay. Our research question is, what's the nature of the crisis in Southern African Development Community countries right now? To what extent is it a liquidity crisis, and to what extent is it a debt crisis? And we go deep into what indicators should be used in the debt sustainability analysis, which is driving the extent to which investors and international institutions are making decisions about how to manage the debt in these countries. The leading indicator that's currently used by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank is something called the Dssi, the Debt Sustainability Analysis, which focuses on debt to GDP ratios. We're going to walk through some of the pros and cons of that, and then talk about another indicator that's been advanced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank called public sector net worth analysis, which looks more at assets, public assets minus the liabilities of a particular country. Then we're going to do a deep dive into China's role in the debt profiles of Southern African developing countries, and examine the extent to which China is playing a big role in accentuating the debt distress in those countries, and then we'll follow with some policy options. Here's Yan Wang.
Good
I'm glad
morning.
your flight from Southern Africa to here in Boston was smooth and clear. I just went over our research questions. I had introduced you, talked about your new book. And since I have the PowerPoint here, why don't I just be your research assistant, and you can tell me when to move from one slide to another, and I'll chime in to the extent that I'm needed. Unless you need to take a deep breath. Are you okay?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kevin, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to have been working with you on this paper. And it's a great pleasure to share my thought with you, with all of you. And as I told the South African audience, I would like to start with a story. And okay, so when I was young, I grew up in China. When I was young, I was sent to the countryside in the northeast China, where there was no electricity, no running of water, and no toilet. It was a very painful experience. So I feel very strongly about the access. It's a basic human right to have access to running water, to have medical care, and to have electricity, and to have food. So I told audience in South Africa that I feel very strongly to development in Africa. So let me share my screen.
Or do you want to? Would you like to swap? I have the PowerPoint up. You want me to close it? And
I can share my screen.
Yep.
But okay, so you can see my screen that the world economy has suffered the biggest shock since the World War II due to the pandemic. The global GDP will be negative 4.9%. Meanwhile, there was a sudden stop and unprecedented large capital outflows from all emerging market economies, and leading to liquidity problems. This has led to the loss of foreign exchange reserves and the local currency depreciation. So on the left, you can see that the blue line after the COVID-19, the capital outflow was huge and unprecedented, larger than those outflows in 2008 global financial crisis. On the right, you can see that after the outflow in March and April, there were some recoveries, but the recovery of capital flow is not universal. It's uneven. So the countries in African continent has not received any capital inflow. So there was this question whether we have a liquidity crisis or debt crisis. So our view is initially it is a liquidity crisis. Now, as the default rate is rising, so now it's debt crisis is looming. So what indicators should be used? I will go fairly quickly regarding the impact of the pandemic in the SADC countries. So this chart is more indicative. One chart, the deep blue shows the impact of on GDP growth. So GDP growth has slowed down, but the accumulation of debt has been increasing. However, this performance varies a great deal across all countries. SADC countries, they set a limit of government debt over GDP of 60%. So as you can see, the increase of debt is closer and closer to 60%. Now, a little bit literature review. First, let's look at the Fisher and Eastley's equation on debt dynamics. So this equation shows that debt over GDP will change. It is determined by three factors: the primary deficit, the real interest rate R, and the growth rate G. So if the primary deficit is greater than seniority, and if the real interest rate is greater than GDP growth rate, then the debt to GDP ratio will continue to soar until there is a debt crisis and people stop buying government bonds. So what is seniority? Seniority is the profit or tax for the government printing money. So the cost of printing money is minimum, like a few cents, but the profit, government can make some profit by printing money. However, for developing countries, the seniority is very little. For international reserve currency like US dollar, the seniority is very large. Please note, public asset has never entered in this equation. And there is no distinction on how deficit was created, whether it's due to government consumption, salaries, wages, or pensions, or it's due to public investment in infrastructure. So over the years, there were three waves of debt accumulation and crisis, and there were two waves of debt relief, one in 1996, one in 2005. It lasted many years, so it's a very complex process. The IMF World Bank debt sustainability framework has gone through many revisions. The 2017 revision was considered obsolete because it misses out the fact that many countries are borrowing from the private sector at market interest rate. So this is by Pinto 2019 paper. In our view, Kevin and I, we think the framework has ignored the public sector asset, including infrastructure asset, including all the power stations, all the reservoirs, and highways and railways, and all the airports built. And thus, this framework has an anti-investment bias. At the meantime, the IMF's fiscal austerity program have forced countries such as Greece to cut public spending to the bone, which is self-defeating, defeating the growth in the economy. So if the denominator is not growing and debt is growing, then the ratio will definitely explode. Also, the framework cannot deal with the issue of large capital inflows and outflows under liberalized capital account. One little story experience from China is China has never experienced a large financial crisis in the last 40 years. So in each of the regional and global financial crises, China has had expansionary fiscal and monetary policy to invest. Invested massively in infrastructure and overcome the crisis. So the IMF managing director, Christine Lagarde, has said during episodes of large capital flight, temporary capital control may be useful. And this is after many years of disagreement with developing countries, and the IMF finally recanted their recommendation of liberalizing capital account. So far, China has had capital controls for many years, and only recently China has gradually started to liberalize capital account. Section 3. Let's look at the sovereign debt in the SADC countries. First, we use the conventional method of debt over GDP. The debt accumulation started in 2010, and it has provided warning sign before the pandemic. In general, if you look at the chart below, in general, the official and multilateral and bilateral creditors are the main creditors, accounting for 60% of the total debt. The amount owed to non-official creditors is decreasing. However, the portion owed to bondholders from the private sector has been increasing, rising fast. As you can see from the news, in the case of Zambia. What about China's role as a creditor? China has been portrayed as the largest creditor. This is due in part to non-transparency of various Chinese lenders and CDB and Exim Bank and some commercial banks like ICBC. But is it the largest? According to our analysis using the Dssi data set, on average, China is the creditor of 17.6% of the external debt for SADC countries, which is around 6% of GDP for the 9 SADC countries. However, our data may not be updated enough. It doesn't cover 2020, the year 2020. But these ratios ignore the asset side of public sector balance sheet, and they neglect the source of debt, whether it's arises due to government consumption, salaries and pensions, or investment. So one impression that the IMF pointed out that China's debt is over 200% of GDP, and the Chinese officials are always arguing that we used debt smartly, investing in infrastructure and etc., including social spending. So sections 4 look at the alternative method. What is the alternative measure for debt? The IMF 2018 publication on managing public wealth highlights the importance of using public sector balance sheet, including all the government-owned and controlled enterprises, corporations, and including financial and non-financial assets. And in this approach, the network, the public sector net worth, which equals to asset minus liability, is key to debt sustainability and credit worthiness. As you can see in the table below, it is very complex to compile data on public sector balance sheet. We could only find the data for 2 countries in SADC group. For Tanzania, the public sector net worth was 45% of GDP in 2014. And for South Africa, it was 151% of GDP in 2016. So this includes both, you can see on the table, this includes both financial and non-financial asset and liabilities. So as you can see, the value for non-financial asset is very difficult to measure because it changes over time, and it is very difficult to change the non-financial asset into financial asset. So that's a caveat for this analysis. In our view, public sector balance sheet should be a very promising measure. Now look at China's role as providers of public asset. So as you know, China has financed or co-financed public sector infrastructure in many countries in Africa. In earlier studies with Justin Yifu Lin, we looked at the China8data.com. There are thousands of projects, but to control for the quality, we used only completed infrastructure projects. So there were 214 completed infrastructure projects in that data set from 2000 to 2014. They are distributed in the 4 sectors here: water, including water supply, and energy, including electricity generation, electricity distribution, power grids, transport, including airports, highways, and railways, and communication, including fiber optic cables. So we found that in 214 completed projects, 78% have helped addressing Africa's bottlenecks. What are bottlenecks? We used a new method of identifying bottlenecks. So in each sector, we used 4 indicators of access to water, access to electricity, and etc. So and then we rank these indicators in Africa, 54 countries, and rank them. And we identify bottleneck 1, bottleneck 2, bottleneck 3. And then we try to map and match Chinese projects, completed projects, with the bottlenecks and found the probability of matching. Okay, we found that probability of matching hard infrastructure projects in 78% of the cases. And we also have an additional analysis on soft infrastructure, including the environment, the investment in health and education. And we found additional 74% of matching the cases. So we strongly support the approach of using public sector balance sheet as a more comprehensive measure of credit worthiness. In addition, studied countries have a good level of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, which the natural capital included subsoil minerals, land, and real estate, and etc. So the structure of these 3 capitals can indicate their balance sheet. So, the comparative advantage. These countries can be divided into labor abundant and natural capital abundant countries with different comparative advantages. And each country may have a different comparative advantage, whether it's eco-friendly tourism or labor abundant manufacturing. So these countries have a lot of potential for export. Section 5, we looked at the behavior of Chinese state actors and found that Chinese state actors are holders of patient capital, as shown by their long history of providing debt relief for African countries. This chart below is from Kress et al. 2000 Rhodian group. So there is a long history of China providing debt relief, And another study, Acker and Deborah Broadcom, they look at thousands of lending by Chinese state sectors, and they found no asset seizure. They found, and they found no evidence of support for the so-called debt trap diplomacy. So this paper is really good paper. And Chinese state sectors have shown some flexibility and forbearance to African countries, brothers and sisters. However, China is unlikely to write off and forgive a large portion of outstanding debt, while rescheduling and refinancing are more common. So you can see from this chart, from 2001 to 2007, and the black bar, the dark blue bar shows the write-off. The cases of write-off was prevalent in earlier years, 2001 to 2007. After the financial crisis, in the recent years, there are fewer and fewer write-offs, more and more refinancing and rescheduling. So their conclusion is China is unlikely to write off a large proportion of the outstanding debt. Only those zero interest loans from Chinese government are eligible to be forgiven in some cases. So conclusion, what more can be done? Policy options. In addition to the DSSI, the debt service moratorium, what are the policy options? We mentioned 5 policy options in this paper. First, we hope all the governments, the countries can support multilateralism and pushing for the IMF to allocate more SDRs and redistribute unused SDRs, as this measure is counter-cyclical and unconditional. So as many advanced countries are using quantitative easing, and the developing countries cannot use quantitative easing. So it is important for the IMF to take a lead and serving as the lender of last resort to issue SDRs. Secondly, we support MDBs, multilateral development banks, and regional financial arrangements for more emergency lending and currency swaps. Third, based on already completed projects which are part of public asset, MDBs and national development banks can design innovative refinancing, including the so-called asset-based refinance. This is our new proposal, and we can elaborate later. We can give some examples. 4, China can utilize tailored solutions in the debt-stressed countries. So we have, in many occasions, suggested to Chinese government to enact foreign aid law, including development corporations. So to promote transparency, accountability, and environmental sustainability. However, in the short term, we need to use some tailored solutions. That may be a long-term task. So far, China has been acting within the common framework agreed by G20 countries. Recently, only last Monday, Zambia have received a debt relief of $110 million. So this is extension of debt service. It's not forgiveness. So China's debt restructuring is driven driven by host countries. So the host country must provide some request and ideas what they want. For example, the so-called Hambantota, it's a very famous Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. This is a case where Sri Lankan government requested China to build this port, and after completion, Sri Lankan government also requested Chinese government to find a private operator to operate this port. So this is a so-called BOT, build, operate, and transfer case. It's a PPPI approach. For Chinese creditors, we think that demonstrated willingness to repay is very important for Chinese creditors. So for example, recently, Pakistan got a new loan of $1.3 billion after repaying an old loan of a similar amount, $1.7 billion. Now, the fifth option is debt for climate swaps. Here, there is now over 30 years of experience with debt for nature swaps, where countries in debt can agree to invest a portion of debt forgiveness in debt relief into natural assets, such as planting trees. One example is seashells. And I'm not an expert, so we can ask Kevin to elaborate on this case. Last but not least, in general, for emerging market and developing countries, it is very important to know what your government owns, that means asset, and what your government owes, meaning liability. So, and it's important to enhance capacity for asset management. The publication by the IMF shows that by enhanced capacity for asset management, you can increase the rate of return from asset by 3 percentage points. In addition, it is important for the government to distinguish patient capital from all those multilateral development banks and national development banks, regional development banks, with those footloose investors, such as bondholders, and to separate the long-term structural issue and the short-term liquidity issues. So again, it's important to utilize patient capital for structural issues such as capacity for development, job creation, special economic zones, and export promotion zones, and improve your export competitiveness. Only in this way, a country can get rid of its debt reliance, meaning the reliance on debt from foreign countries. Okay, I'll stop here, and I would love to exchange ideas and receive your comments. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Wang. I invite everyone, I forgot to mention this in my introductory remarks, I invite everyone to go into the little Q&A button underneath the, on the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom, and first introduce yourself, and secondly, ask a question. I'll cluster 3 or 4 of these for Dr. Yang, and then she can answer them. Maybe I'll jump in too if they're more directed to things in my expertise, and then we'll do a couple rounds of these. So let me start with Juliet Liu, who's a postdoctoral fellow at your alma mater at Cornell University. She says she appreciates the way that your talk complicates and pushes back against the debt trap narrative. But should we think of China as a relatively new lender, which is evolving in its role, ? For example, when write-off or suspensions occur, these came very early years Perhaps this can be explained by Chinese lenders making high risk or politically motivated loans, question mark. Nowadays, with China lending so widely, do you think Chinese lenders will change their debt forgiveness tendency or willingness to negotiate terms? And might the COVID crisis force an increasingly stretched Chinese foreign debt system to contract and become more conservative moving forward in the future? That's 2 or 3 questions in one, so maybe I'll only ask a couple here. So Deborah Brodigan, who you mentioned a couple times in your remarks, is here. Hi, Deborah. She's from Johns Hopkins University, SICE, Carrie standing for the China Africa Research Initiative. She says the idea of asset-based refinance sounds real interesting, but what does this actually mean? I hope to hear more. And would these assets become actual collateral for these loans, question mark? And the last one in this cluster I'll ask is from Zelda Liang. Zelda Liang is a visiting scholar at Columbia University. She says, thank you for the insightful talk. And she would like to know, may I know whether the data of Chinese loans includes loans from the state-owned commercial banks for infrastructure projects as well? Would you please also share more about how the increasing use of public-private partnerships have been affecting debt structure in SADC countries and developing countries in more general? Well, that's a big cluster of 3. There's many more, but why don't you answer, touch on some of those, and then if we have time, we'll come back and do another round or 2.
Yeah, I will try to address these questions to my best ability, but Kevin, please fill in. Question 1, maybe China or Chinese banks are new lenders and making politically motivated loans. Yes, possible, but China has been working with African countries since the 1960s, 70s. So there is expansion of different forms of cooperation. Initially involve Chinese government, and then later involves a lot of state-owned banks and state-owned enterprises, large contractors. So I cannot exclude the cases of politically motivated lending, but I think there may be some overborrowing and overlending on both sides. So as I visited many African countries many times, and I found that African leaders have the same aspiration of developing their own countries, and they may borrow quite a lot, and they may be ambitious to have new infrastructure projects. And the Chinese lenders are big lenders, and they are used to finance large infrastructure. So there may be overlending and overborrowing on both sides. After the COVID-19, I think Chinese leaders are going to rethink their strategies, and there may be a tendency to have a new debt sustainability framework in place and implemented by Chinese lenders. Second, for Deborah's question on asset-based refinance, this is not an entirely new idea. Asset-based finance has been used in many countries, including Angola, the famous Angola case. And I am saying, we are saying, Kevin and I, we are saying that one example is that if an internationally financed infrastructure project, this project is completed and form public asset, and then if the host government has repaid maybe 30%. So this host government owns 30% of equity. That can be used if the government agrees. That can be used as a base, asset base for refinancing in the amount of 30%. So any multilateral development banks can issue this loan on an asset-based refinance. And this will improve the country's liquidity, meaning new loans, new money will inflow into the country, but not hurting the country's credit worthiness. Third, data quality issues. Indeed, the data quality is doubtful because there is a non-transparency of Chinese lending to African countries, including some of the lenders are totally state-owned, such as China Development Bank, but they are lending at a commercial basis and commercial interest rate. So I think you should understand CDB, similar to the World Bank. World Bank Group is divided by IDA, IBRD, and IFC. IFC is completely a private sector arm of the World Bank. So CDB has also issued private sector loans, commercial loans, and these commercial loans are at a commercial interest rate. So I think this is the way to understand their lending behavior.
Great. I think a couple things that I would add. Number one is that yes, indeed, Chinese overseas development finance has lacked transparency, and a number of us, including for Africa in particular, Deborah Broadgum's one of the just asked a question, and I encourage everyone to go to the SICE-CARI webpage at Johns Hopkins, and there they have a detailed database of Chinese overseas development and state-owned enterprise loan commitments. All right, so that's where you can get an idea of what the commitments have been over time. The World Bank, after the G20 DSSI agreement back in April, created the debt service suspension initiative, and the World Bank has really added to global transparency about this, and that's some of the data that we used for this paper. And now you can get an idea of what different countries have to pay in terms of debt service payments in 2020, 2021, 2022, and I think 2023 as well. So you can get a fairly good picture by looking at SICE-CARI for Africa in terms of commitments, and a good picture from the DSSI database at the World Bank with respect to with the payments they're owed, and that's a real big improvement. Now, despite that, the World Bank data just says how much payments are owed to Chinese entities from 2020 to 2023, and it doesn't say which ones there were. And the United States and others created a narrative that the China Development Bank and some of the other overseas development finance institutions were not participating in that, and that's turned out not to be true. The good news is there was pressure about this, and then China revealed the data. And a couple things are important for everyone to know, so we can be more empirical minded about all this. Number one is that China is the largest participant in the DSSI thus far, larger than the Paris Club. They decided not to join the Paris Club effort in the DSSI, but to work in parallel and work bilateral with its different creditors. And it's actually suspended more debt than the Paris Club has to date. Now, yes, the denominator for China is larger than the Paris Club's denominator because China is the largest bilateral creditor. Number two, there was a narrative that the China Development Bank in particular was not participating in debt suspension. That turned out not to be true as well. They've suspended a significant amount of debt in this case of Zambia, and yesterday they listed on their webpage what their what their debt suspension has been thus far, as has the Export-Import Bank of China. So applauding increasing transparency on the China side. It has definitely been a little more slow and more opaque than what the World Bank, et cetera, are now. But you do have to remember, it wasn't until Robert Zoellick's Open Data Initiative at the World Bank until the World Bank was transparent. We used to all guess about this stuff until about 2005 as well. One thing that has occurred this week, going into the G20 meetings this weekend, is that the G20 has recognized that debt suspension is not enough. That the credit downgrades among emerging market and developing countries are already at an all-time high, much higher than even the debt crisis in the 1980s and 1990s, and therefore they have put forth the beginnings of a debt relief effort. Now, according to the draft communique by the finance ministers that came out on Monday, it appears that thus far China has not signed on to that piece of it. If you read it closely, it looks like just the Paris Club has. That remains to be seen. We'll see what it looks like this weekend. And of course, this is always an evolving process. There was another question by Ava Paus, which I think Ava Paus, a good friend and one of the best economists looking at the economic development of Latin America and beyond, asked a question. Given the dominance of non-financial assets among governance assets and the difficulty of changing them into financial assets, how realistic is it to focus on asset-based refinance? And if the loans go south, or if they're not unable to be paid, then does the government have to privatize? That's a question for Yan Wang. That we partially answer that by saying we're not just saying collateralize. That's the second part of a Deborah Brodigan question too. We're not just saying collateralize the existing loans. We're saying that use the equity that's already in them to refinance for more finance and a different set of maturities. We also have a question from Randy Henning at American University, also a good friend of the GDP Center. He says, thank you for this presentation. I agree that developing better measures of debt and thus debt sustainability is an important project. He has two questions. So, one, the IFIs have also been using gross financing needs as a measure. What's your assessment of gross financing needs? Does it suffer from the same shortcomings that you identify for the simple debt to GDP measures? And number two, are you suggesting that debt owed to patient and footloose creditors be treated differently in a debt restructuring? Let's see if I can find, there's a couple questions, one by Jerry Harris from the National Secretariat of the Global Studies Association, and another one by Isaac Nundo from the University of the Cape Coast in Ghana. They both ask, what's your opinion, Yang Wang, on the extent to which a lot of this Chinese overseas development finance is economically driven versus geopolitically driven, is more what Isaac Nando is asking. And Jerry Harris says, is there a fundamentally different vision of development with respect to Chinese overseas finance, whereas the IMF clearly has been driven by a more neoliberal or neoclassical approach? Is the Chinese approach different? Obviously, you wrote a whole book about that with Justin Lin. So we only have about 10 minutes left. So why don't you answer those questions and make any final remarks that you might want to make.
Thank you very much for all the interesting questions. Those are very complex and difficult questions. First question regarding the difficulties of transforming non-financial assets into financial assets. How realistic? Okay, so I agree, and we provided a footnote in the paper that it is very difficult to measure and transfer the non-financial assets into liquid financial assets. So as time passes. So according to this view that is based on asset management length, I think both Chinese lenders and some of the new structural economists consider that a country's endowment and asset is a better measure of their credit worthiness. So basically, the development ideas is not based on short-term liquidity, financial asset, but we based on countries' endowment and their potential for export. So it may be difficult to pre-assume that a country have to privatize, but in the case of a default, creditors, long-term creditors and debtors can negotiate whether this asset can be privatized or swapped with some other asset, such as natural assets. So the swap of debt to climate is a realistic option. Question on IFI growth financing, which I don't know very much about the new growth financing need model, but later I will elaborate on our vision of development. Secondly, whether patient capital will be treated differently. This is definitely not, but patient capital and footloose capital should be treated equally, but patient capital is more willing and flexible in terms of extending the terms because the patient capital is ultra long-term. And they are equity-like investors, very much like taking equity stake in the development of a country. Third question, maybe some of the lending is driven by geopolitics. I'm not an expert on geopolitics. I cannot exclude some of the lending with geopolitic motivation. I cannot exclude. So regarding the vision of development, I think I've been working with Justin Yifulin for 12 years, and our vision is using the new structural economics to explain the development. So the new structural economics focus on a country's endowment. The structure of endowment can indicate this country's comparative advantage, and country government can play a bigger role in targeting the comparative advantage or latent comparative advantage for export. And only if you develop some capacity for export, then you can reduce the reliance on debt. Do we have some time? How many minutes do I have?
5 minutes to make a closing remark.
So it has been a great pleasure working on this topic, and this is our opportunity to address some of the myths behind the neoliberalism. I think in China and in many other countries, there is a blind belief of the neoliberalism. So it is a very good opportunity to address this myth over debt over GDP ratio and also the debt sustainability framework. But I have my own limitations. According to some comments I received from the other conference, that IMF recently, in the last year, have revised the debt sustainability framework and revised the debt assessment reports analysis. So I'm not up to date on their own new revisions in the last year. So there are some limitations in our research. Additionally, there are limitations on data and data availability. So this debt-based, this asset-based refinancing is a new proposal, and it's not yet supported by empirical evidence. So it's a new proposal. So I hope to receive many comments, and I hope in the future we can have some cases that supporting the asset-based refinance. This is one way of getting the countries out of the debt cycle, the vicious cycle of debt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Yan, and thanks everyone for coming. One other question was, can we look at the paper in more detail? We're happy to say that the working paper version of this is out today, and we just put that in the chat, so you can link to that. And both Yan Wang and I really welcome any more detailed comments you have. This is part of a larger book project that is being put together by academics at the University of Pretoria for the current situation in Southern Africa. So we welcome your input on that. And we also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter for the Global China Initiative. And if you're interested in these larger sort of debt and development issues, the newsletter for our Global Economic Governance Initiative, we're also sending out that newsletter today with a whole host of new knowledge products focused on the G20 meeting with some colleagues earlier this week. I actually encourage everyone to go to our webpage, and we launched something called the Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery Initiative, where we're calling on the G20 to go beyond debt suspension and debt relief in certain situations and outline a whole 3-pillar system on how that would work. You can go to our webpage and see a little write-up about that and watch videos that support the initiative by Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Mia Mottley, the current Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Barbados. Invite you all also to come continue the conversation about SADC countries tomorrow. Tomorrow at 7:30 a.m. to be in concert with our friends in Africa. We'll be co-launching a new report on titled "Expanding Renewable Energy for Access and Development: The Role of Development Finance Institutions in Southern Africa." The result of a 1.5-year project with partners in Africa on the role that development banks need to play and can play in an energy shift for sustainable transformation in Southern African countries. So please join us tomorrow. Please sign up for our newsletters, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you, Yan Wang, for this great presentation.